The NFL draft is officially in the rear view mirror, and now we are officially, I guess, in the dog days of the off season as we now have a very long wait before training camp. But in the meantime, we have a lot of stuff to talk about. So welcome into the Payne and Drain Show. My name is Zach Payne. I'm one half of this show, and I'm joined as always by Alex Drain. And Alex, how are we feeling following the NFL draft?
Pretty good. It's more or less the end of the off season, so we finally get a bit of a picture of what the rosters will look like for these various teams, and I think the Lions are sitting in a pretty good position, but there's definitely some things to talk about with the draft, so I'm sure that this episode will be a bit interesting, particularly when we get to the third pick that the Lions took in this draft.
Yeah, so definitely a lot to talk about. So, on today's show, we are going to quickly break down some pieces of news that dropped since the last episode we recorded. We will get into the Lions draft class, in depth analysis on every single pick, as well as, the other factors around those picks. And then we will break down the rivals picks, the Packers, Vikings, and Bears, just quickly recapping their draft classes, not nearly in as much depth as you'll find elsewhere, but just so that you guys know where the Lions rivals stand. And then we will give our overall thoughts on this roster as we head into the real, like, dog days of the offseason, as I mentioned before. Training camp and just how this roster is shaping up overall. So to start with, the Lions, the day we dropped our last episode, announced a 4-year, $86 million contract extension for Kirby Joseph, making him the highest paid safety in the league. Although, in the days since, we also got the contract details, and it really isn't as monumental as was initially reported because the Lions have $39 million of that contract tacked on as a void year in year 5. So, what are your thoughts on this extension, and what, like, for those who maybe aren't familiar, what does that void year being so, like, having such a big cap hit, what does that mean for the overall breakdown of this contract?
I'll let you handle the void year part of it. I will take the first half there. Uh, the Kirby extension, as when you look at the top line numbers and how it sort of broke down over 4 years, that's not like crazy at first. When I was looking at this earlier in the off season, I was thinking like, yeah, 4 years in the like 76 million range, roughly, around the 19 per season when we talk about just the pure average before getting into the structure. So that's right in the ballpark. I was looking at the other safeties, and I think he's coming off first team All Pro, so that all makes sense to me. As for the sort of decision to pay him, I think that makes sense. He played well enough, right? Again, first team All Pro. You probably are going to keep that level of player around. Does it call into question the future of Jameson Williams, say, with the franchise? Probably, because you can only pay so many guys. And I think in general, it's a good idea to sort of select key players at each positional group. To have one guy you pay, if that guy holds down the fort as a star, then you can sort of get by with more replacement level players around them once you're in a sort of capped out roster structure. So you look across the team, okay, Amon-Ra St. Brown is getting paid at wide receiver. That could call into question JMO, but it is what it is. You look at offensive line, okay, Penei Sewell's getting the big bucks. You look at defensive line, and in the tackle position, McNeil's gotten paid. Edge position, Hutchinson will in the near future. Linebacker, it's not going to be that expensive, but Campbell, in theory, is your long-term guy to pay there. Then you go into the secondary at safety, Kirby Joseph. And then you have the Brian Branch thing. I don't think there's any hesitation that they will pay Branch, but you can probably get away with it because at the moment you don't have anybody at corner that's looking like that level. Now, obviously, if Terrion Arnold becomes an all-pro corner, then you have a bit of a decision to make with him versus Branch versus Joseph, how many sort of max deals you can have in the secondary. But look, Terrion Arnold becomes a first-team all-pro corner. That's a good problem to have. So at the end of the day, you pay what you have in certainty, and I think they can afford this Kirby Joseph deal, and he's a good enough player that it's worth doing it. So that's my take on it. Wasn't really that surprising. We went into this offseason thinking this was going to be the offseason of Kirby Joseph and then Aiden Hutchinson getting deals. So they got one of them done, and right around the same point in the calendar that they got the deals done last year with St. Brown and Sewell. That was right around the draft. So it all logically makes sense.
Yeah, so I guess as we mentioned, the more curious part is the actual breakdown of this contract because you see highest paid safety and you're like, okay, that means the cap hits are going to be off the charts for the duration of that contract and the Lions are going to have to work around that. But actually, not yet. It's actually kind of a weird structure. So the Lions, Kirby, the way they structured it is they have option bonuses every year for Kirby Joseph, and the way that'll work is it'll keep the cap hit down, but the bill will come due at some point. So in year one, the cap hit is just 3.8 million. In year two, 5.8 million. In year three, 9.1 million. Year four, 13 million. I guess the year one is still technically his last year of his rookie deal, I should
Yep.
clarify. And then the year four of the extension, the cap hit will get to 17 million. All of those are relatively affordable. It gets a little bit more every year. But then in year five, the Lions have a void year tacked on that has a cap hit of 39 million, which the Lions will not be paying that in 4 years, do not, or 5 years, do not worry. But what it means is at some point, the Lions, whether they cut Kirby Joseph in the future, whether they work another extension out in the future, there is going to be a large 25 plus $1 million cap hit for Kirby Joseph at some point in the future. If that's not in 5 years, let's say they extend him, they'll just kick that can another 4 or 5 years down the line. If they cut him in 2029, then it'll be around a $27 million cap hit in dead cap that they have to pay. So it's it is a little confusing, but essentially the Lions are using these options to keep the cap hits down for while Joseph is playing on this contract, and then whether it's his next contract or he gets cut, that's when the bill will come due. So it is kind of fascinating because it will allow the Lions to retain a Brian Branch at the same position, to potentially retain a Jameson Williams, who we'll talk about in just a second. So I like kind of the cap maneuvering, but do you worry like if the Lions get a little too chummy with these option bonuses that you run too much of a risk of having 1 year where you just have no salary cap?
It's definitely a risk. We in the years we've seen Holmes as a GM, he does love the void years. Like they tack those on a lot. And but this is kind of I don't remember another contract that they've signed that was like this sort of thing. Um, so it's a little bit unique, but this is the NFL. We've seen teams do this. I mean, the Saints are the worst example of kicking the can down the road. They have all this money tied up and they just keep restructuring it and pushing it down, but it does create this looming axe above your neck, so to speak. But if you do it with just one player, I think you can be okay. I like that it buys them the time of these next few years when you're in theory in a peak contention window, and maybe there does come a point down the road where you have to take a bit of a step backwards to swallow that. But I think if it's at the trade-off of giving yourself the best chance possible to build peak rosters to actually try and win the Super Bowl, which this franchise has been waiting 60 years to do, I don't think people will be that upset about it. So it has its trade-offs. I would say, probably again, don't do this with like five different guys and then have
Yeah.
some sort of hand situation going on. But you can do it once as a treat, and you'll probably be okay with it. So I don't have a major issue. It is interesting, but eh,
Yeah. So I like if we find out next week that Aiden Hutchinson signs like a 5 year hundred or like $200 million
yeah,
contract and they have defaulted like 70 million of that to 2031, then that is where it's gonna be like, okay, we need to
yeah.
reevaluate what we're doing. But for now, like you said, one player, not a problem. It just is this a gonna become a trend? Who knows? But speaking of Hutchinson, the Lions also announced after day one, Hutchinson and Jameson Williams both had their 5th year options exercised. That should firmly put any trade rumors about JMO to bed. There was never any truth to them. It was purely other execs around the league speculating, and one Lions beat reporter that decided that he wanted to trade Jameson Williams for some reason. So don't worry there. Extension for Hutch, we still expect to come sometime this offseason. I still hope that they can get that done before the Bengals get Trey Hendrickson's extension done or before the Cowboys get Micah Parsons' extension done, just to get those out of the way. But so yeah, those fifth year options. Do you have any takes? Like, seems
No, I
pretty
mean
cut and dry.
those are no doubt options that you pick up. Hutchinson, like to get that one done sooner rather than later. That said, there isn't really any reason for concern. Like Hutchinson is a franchise player. He's from the area. Yeah, I don't think he's dodging negotiations because he wants to go to the Raiders, right? Like it's fine. Whenever they get it done, they'll get it done. No issue there. JMO, you got to pick that up just to see. This next year will be very interesting with him, and we'll talk about it a lot in the fall, going into the season preview, all that stuff, because this is going to be the season that determines what that contract sort of looks like. Because next off season is when the Lions will probably have to make a decision. You'll go into that final year, and you'll have to sort of decide, okay, what is his extension price? Can we afford it? If we can't, do we bring him back as a sort of lame duck year and then just potentially let him walk and get a comp pick, or do we trade him then? Right, that would be the time to do it. Trading him this offseason never made sense. You want that extra year to see what his actual price will be, because if he goes from 1,000 yards to 1,400, the price just went up a lot. If he goes from 1,000 yards to 750 because he's injured or whatever happens, then that changes the game as well. So this is a big year, and the fifth year option just buys you time. That's why you draft a guy in the first round to get that fifth year option, get a little longer time to evaluate, and a little cheaper on the rookie deal. So makes perfect sense to pick it up, and we'll see what he can do with it this year.
Yeah. So with that being said, we will now dive into the draft recap. Now, before we get into the Lions picks, how upset were you when the Steelers took Derek Harmon?
Yeah, that was unfortunate, but based on some of the mock drafts, it did start to seem like he was going to go. It was an interesting draft because the interior linemen went pretty high. Like Kenneth
Mhm.
Grant, who we talked about, there was a lot of the mock drafts had him going, 29th, 30th. He goes, was it 13th to Miami, 11th, something like that. It was very, very high in the middle part of the draft. And then Derek Harmon goes, and then obviously the Lions took Tyleik Williams, who we'll get to in a moment. All those guys went, while a number of the edges that we thought were going to go in the first round, like Mike Green, and that one had the off-the-field stuff, but even Ezeraku as well, those guys both fell to the second round, which I don't think a lot of people were really thinking was going to happen. So that was an interesting kind of development that might have been a bigger storyline if the Shadur Sanders thing hadn't happened, but that was all we were allowed to talk about for 3 days.
Yeah, this is not going to be a podcast about Mel Kiper, but oh man, I know people have their takes on the draft coverage. It is hilarious that this fifth round quarterback is the most talked about prospect in the discourse around Sanders has been just completely ridiculous at this point. Like it's been so nauseating. But that let's get this back on the tracks. Let's talk about the Lions. That's what we're here to do. As you said, round one, pick 28. The Lions take Tyleik Williams out of Ohio State, a pick that wasn't necessarily off the board in terms of like what fans and analysts were hoping. It was more so adjacent to it. Some guys had this pegged as a Lions pick. I know the guys at the Athletic, Colton Pouncey and Nick Baumgartner, they had highlighted Tyleik as a probable Lions pick, like a really good fit in terms of off the field and on the field. So it just isn't the pass rusher that you and I had talked about last week getting in the first round or in the first few rounds. So what does Tyleik bring to the Lions, and how do you feel about this pick?
Well, first thing I feel about it is mad that we didn't talk about this more in depth last week, but we talked about like 35 players, and we mentioned him, but we glazed over it. Things you learn in year one of doing a podcast, but oh well. The reason I didn't bring him up as much is because he was, again, not really known for the pass rush juice, and we sort of thought if they were going line, that would be where they were going. But they did meet with him, so in hindsight, we should have looked into that a little bit more. What I think with Tyleik Williams is that he is a good player, and I have no doubt that he will be a good NFL player. Like, I think he's a very safe pick in that way. I saw him a number of times over the years watching Ohio State, and he was a big part of the turnaround at Ohio State over the last few years on the defensive line. When he was a freshman in 2021, Ohio State had a really, really poor rush defense. They got run all over by Oregon early that year, and then, of course, they get run over by Michigan to the tune of 250 rushing yards in that game and 5 rushing touchdowns. Michigan refused to throw the ball in the second half of that game, and Ohio State knew it was coming and couldn't stop it. And it was just a really poor situation, defensive tackle. And then over the course of the next 3 years, as Tyleek grows up, they go from that situation at tackle to the best defensive line in college football, particularly against the run. That was how they won the national championship this past year, and Tyleek Williams was a big part of that. And he's a big guy. I think he's around 320, 330, something in that range. So he's not. He can do sort of both things on the line, right? He can play some nose tackle. He's not just a 350-pound mammoth who is purely a nose. He's also not a 295 kind of pass rusher who has issues against the run. He can kind of do both things. And in that way, the comparison a lot of people threw out is Aleem McNeil, right? That's sort of like the best case here is Aleem McNeil 2.0. And I think in a world where you have Tyleek Williams and Aleem McNeil together in a couple years, that'd be a lot for any interior offensive line to handle. So from that perspective, I don't have an issue. The pass rush part, yeah, he doesn't really have, at least in his time at Ohio State, didn't really show the tenacious ability to rip into the backfield with regularity. But part of that was how he was being used in the sense that, go back to 2023, he was the guy that was soaking up the double teams to allow Michael Hall Jr., who was their sort of explosive pass rusher on the interior, to jolt into the backfield. This past year, he played more next to Ty Hamilton, who played some more nose, and then he was sort of 3-tech, but he's got a few moves. He can definitely get rush here and there. It's just not in his main wheelhouse, and so from that perspective, I had him below Harmon, but I think he'll be a good player. And as we talked about when we talked about Harmon last week, this is definitely a position of need. People talked about edge so much, but the long-term position at tackle was pretty up in the air outside of McNeil. Williams brings them some certainty. So I think he'll be a good player for the Lions. And at the end of the day, that's the most important part.
Yeah, like I think there's two projections here. There's the short term and the long term. In the short term, this season, his rookie year, with Aleem McNeil probably going to miss the first 2 months of the season at least. Tyleek is going to play more 3-tech because DJ Rader's the nose tackle, and you're going to have Tyleek out there on early downs to soak up some of the run stops, to allow Levi Onwuzurike and Mekhi Wingo, when he gets healthy, to take on more of the pass rushing responsibility. Long term, McNeil is your 3-tech, like he is he is the primary pass rusher and a good run defender. Tyleek will then slide more into the nose tackle spot as DJ Reader moves on because he's in the last year of his contract and he's getting up there in age. He's not quite as effective anymore, so it's not worth bringing him back. So if Tyleek can be a super effective run stuffing nose tackle with the flexibility to move out to up to 3-tech if you need it, if he can provide any pass rush juice, that's a bonus. But like you said, it's more about soaking up the double teams. And so there's two parts. So soaking up double teams so that Hutchinson faces one-on-one matchups as often as possible and McNeil faces one-on-one matchups as often as possible. But also, this is about early downs. The Lions, they are just reinforcing. They want to get back to being a top 5 run defense in the league. We saw that slip last year as the injuries piled up. So for Detroit, it's not so much about getting as whatever percent pressure rate every third down. It's about putting you in as many 3rd and 8s as possible where all their pass rushers can pin their ears back and go after the quarterback. The difference between 3rd and 5, 3rd and 8, we see the Lions on the flip side of this. Every time the Lions are in a 3rd and medium, they run the ball because they know they're going for it on 4th. The Lions don't want teams to do that to them. They want to stop the run early to set up the pass rush later. You hear this terminology with coaches where it's like you got to earn the right to rush the passer. So that's what this kind of pick is. Will it be the flashiest pick of all time? No. Is it going to be effective? Yes. And as you mentioned, we probably should have known this was coming because he fits the principles of the Lions defense. They met with him. We probably should have identified that they might go this direction.
Yeah, and you look at the defensive tackle position now, and there is really a good situation between the guys you added and the guys you brought back. You have Reader, you have Tyleek Williams now, you brought back Levi Onwuzurike, you have Mekhi Wingo coming back off of injury, you signed Roy Lopez, and then Aaliyah McNeil whenever he is back. So that's 6 players that you feel very comfortable with by the time the playoffs roll around, provided that the Black Plague does not arrive this year as it did last year. But um, you can kind of sense with Tyleik Williams being drafted a desire to cut back the snaps for DJ Reader, which seemed evident when they signed Roy Lopez, but this sort of reinforces it. But as you mentioned, with the run defense in general, at the end of the day, I always say this: if you can't stop the run, the game is over before it starts.
Yeah.
Can't stop the pass. Maybe some things can intervene. Maybe you get a lucky break with an interception, or maybe the receivers drop the ball. Whatever. If you can't stop the run, it's pretty much over. The offense will just do that. They'll milk the clock the whole time, and they won't even need to threaten that other phase. So that's objective number one. And getting Tyleik Williams, putting him in there, I think that should make this a very good run defense. And the Lions like guys that are disciplined in both phases, as opposed to guys that are sort of reckless and can only do one thing. We see that particularly at edge, where they like guys who can set the edge. They believe in stopping the run, so this makes sense. And we know that they like drafting from reliable programs. And Ohio State, obviously, one of the elite ones out there. And then they spent the rest of the draft selecting from a different reliable program. But everything else makes a lot of sense on this pick.
I guess last note on this, there's a possibility DJ Reader might not be on this team in the fall. I'm realizing because, or the alternative is Broderick Martin just going to get cut?
I think he might. I think that's that's my
Like
guess.
so if you really believe in Broderick Martin as a developmental interior defensive lineman that they picked in the third round, then DJ Reader probably gets cut. If Reader's still good enough to warrant being your starting nose tackle, you don't want to go to Lopez or Williams in this year, then Martin's just not gonna make it, and that will probably that's probably the worst pick of the Holmes era so far.
Yeah, that's the way I see it. Reader is, I think he is still certainly good enough to be on the team. I think it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when they're not tight up against the cap. They have a lot of cap space because they love to prioritize the rollover cap, all that stuff we talked about in the past. It doesn't make a lot of sense to move on from a guy that you played quite a bit and was decent for you, especially in favor of a player that in 2 seasons has played like 40 NFL snaps, and they were not good snaps. So when Tyleik Williams was drafted, that was definitely one of the immediate thoughts is like, well, that seems like it for Broderick Martin. And if it is, well, I guess the best thing you can say is that the biggest mistake of Holmes' draft record thus far is a third-round pick.
Yeah,
Right? Not a first rounder, not a second rounder. The third rounder you can kind of live with, but it's
yeah.
uh,
Same time though, we've talked about our gripes with the long-term developmental projects in the third and fourth round that we'll also have to talk about in a little bit. But first, round 2, pick 57, Tate Ratledge, a guard out of Georgia. The Lions, like you said, go back to a reliable program. We talked about the fact that the Lions didn't really do anything to replace Kevin Zeitler. It seemed like Christian Mahogany might just be penciled in as a starter. Here is your competition. Like, this is just going to be an open competition for the one of the starting guard slots, and that's what the Lions live off of. They believe iron sharpens iron. They want that internal competition. So Ratledge, round 2 guard, looks like he could, if he's not starting this year, he'll start in 2026 when Glasgow is eventually gone. This just seems like a super solid pick, reinvesting in what makes you special.
yeah, this was a guy that we did briefly talk about when we talked about the guards. There weren't that many that seemed plausible for the Lions, and the 2 Georgia guys were among the most viable. Tate Ratledge and Dylan Fairchild was the other one. Fairchild, I think, was seen as a little more developmental. Ratledge considered more pro-ready at the moment. 3-year starter at Georgia, graded out pretty well in pass protection. Decent as a run blocker as well, but he's got all of the traits that they look for, right? Mean guy, plays with aggression, team captain. He has some hard pictures, like hunting turkeys and on his Instagram. He has a mullet, right? He had like a tattoo of a lion on him. Like, well, whatever. It makes sense. And the funniest thing I think in the draft for the Lions was what happened on day 2, where they selected 2 players who graded out as extraordinarily athletic in the RAS score. Uh, Ratledge was the first of the two. And then at the draft that night, they're wearing these like custom made hoodies that have HWS crossed out, I believe, and that was supposed to denote height, weight, speed, which they claimed was bad and was the opposite of scouting, because they do real scouting, which is watching tape. And it's like, okay, but you also just drafted two guys, including one guy with the next pick that might not have been drafted at all if he didn't do what he did at the combine. So that was a bit of a humorous subplot, because the first thing that really does jump out at you about Ratledge, besides what he did at Georgia, is the fact that he had these incredible testing numbers. And the Lions have always been, under Holmes, a team that prioritizes those kinds of things. And I don't have an issue with that, right? Like, this guy is big, he's strong, and he moves well. And that's notable for a team that runs the ball a lot and runs a lot of gap plays. You're going to pull him around. You need to get him across the field, get him in space, and hit those blocks. And he certainly seems able to do it. So I don't see any reason why Ratledge can't compete for a guard spot on this team. And they draft another guard later on who we'll get to, and both those guys will have shots for playing time alongside Mahogany, alongside Glasgow. And that'll be probably one of the most interesting battles in camp, because I expect him to come in ready to play.
Yeah, it's going to be like training camp. Those offensive versus defensive line battles are going to be a ton of fun, as they always are, with how good both those groups are for the Lions. So, and with Ratledge, you mentioned good in pass pro, maybe still a bit of work to do in run blocking, but when you get put next in between Penei Sewell and Frank Ragnow, suddenly your run blocking can become a lot better. It's a wild concept. Put him next to all pros, and he's going to be a lot better. So, and same can be said about the guard they take later, who again is more of a pass protector. So, honestly, not a ton else to say. Like, it's just a solid second round guard that you expect to compete for starting reps sooner rather than later. So let's go ahead. Actually, sorry, before we move on, should mention they trade up 3 spots for Ratledge. And for the people that were mad about when they took an edge in this draft, supposedly Holmes was trying to trade up for an edge in the second round. They couldn't make something work. Now, I'm assuming they would have traded up for Nick Scorton. That's my prediction, because Ezuraku, they could have had him in the first round. He was probably a first round prospect, but he is more of a pass rusher. He doesn't set the edge as well in run defense. He would have to be played a little sparingly at times. So I don't think the Lions were really going to take him unless he fell pretty far in the draft, which obviously didn't happen. I think Scorton, not nearly as like explosive necessarily, but he's a little bit more well-rounded. So if there was an edge that they would have taken, I think it would have been him.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable guess. The other one I thought of, but this one doesn't make sense because he didn't go in the second round, was Landon Jackson. That was another guy that sort of fit the bill, but he fell to the third round. They ended up taking Tisla over him. But Skirton, among the guys that went in the second round, does make the most sense, just because his body type, they like those big edges. They like guys in the Hutchinson mold that can set the edge and can do a lot of different things. So from that perspective, it makes sense. And Skirton ended up going quite a bit ahead of the Lions, if I remember correctly, like 10 plus picks ahead.
Yeah, I
Let me
think
look at the
I think it was
draft
the
order here.
Panthers traded up to 51, I believe. But
Okay, yeah, 51. You're right. So well, 9 picks ahead of where they were, 6 picks
yeah,
ahead. That's still quite a bit. So
so yeah, they do a minor trade up, which you could do a trade up for 3 spots to get your guy. That's great. What isn't as popular, certainly, is in the third round, the Lions trade up from 102 all the way to 70, trading 3 third round picks, 102 and both third rounders next year, to trade up for wide receiver Isaac Tesla, who, as you mentioned, is the ultimate height, weight, and speed guy. So there's two parts that we have to break down. Let's first start with the trade up, and then we'll focus on the prospect later. So just in a vacuum, moving up 32 spots in the third round, essentially a full round, with just the third round is larger with the comp picks and all that. What are your thoughts on the trade up and Holmes' aggression in the draft?
well, so first of all, with the trade up element of it, at the time everyone was like, "Oh my God, this is the worst trade up I've ever seen." and then they pull out the draft chart, and it was a lot more even on the draft value chart than people kind of had thought. I don't know how much stock I really put into that, just simply because the biggest tenet is the principle of future devaluation, that current picks are worth more than future picks. Um, and it kind of eye of beholder of whether you want to believe that or not. What I will say is that there's nothing against the possibility that he just keeps trading future picks for the now, right? Like, oh, we don't have any thirds next year. Well, you can just trade 2027 thirds for get 2026, right? Like you can, much in the void year thing, you can always just keep kicking it down the road further if you trade the next year. So I don't know from that perspective. I feel like with this trade up that if they had done this trade up to get Landon Jackson, I would have been more like, yeah, I kind of see that. You're filling a this year right now need that makes some sense. With Tisla, I don't know. I think what I'll say about the trade up for Tisla is that it heightens the need for him to work. Right? That like if you stuck it wherever they were, wasn't like 100 something like that.
Yeah,
If you
102.
stuck at that 102, if you stick at 102 when you take Tisla there, it's like okay, this is interesting. Hope it works out. But if it doesn't, it's like well, we took our shot on a guy there. But with the amount of draft capital you invested, moving up that amount, throwing those third rounders in, now it isn't just we hope he works out. It's like he needs to work out. He needs to become a starting wide receiver, not an all pro, but a starting wide receiver at some point in his career, or it will be a pretty big error just with the amount you poured in. That is a lot of capital invested, and it needs to pan out, and that's the risk there. And I think ultimately what gets people fairly skittish is that we've seen Holmes do this a couple times now, and we don't know that it works yet. You had the Martin one. Doesn't seem like that one worked. You had Giovanni Manu last year. Too early to tell there. So we'll see what happens.
Even
And
Hendon
then you have
Hooker to
this
an
one.
extent.
Yeah, to some degree, although he was not really, I mean, developmental in the sense that all mid-round quarterbacks are, but he was also old, right? And he
Yeah.
was like a guy at a big program that people knew about and started a lot of games. These are more stabbing. I mean, Broderick Martin, no one had really heard of. Giovanni Manu, zero people had heard of. Tisla, no one had heard of really until Combine, and even then, it was sort of like, well, this is interesting. So these prospects, and some people throw out Colby Sorsdahl as well.
Yeah, William and
From
Mary, like
years
I get
ago.
it.
Yeah, but I don't care about that one as much because it's the fifth round at that point.
Yeah.
It's all a stab in the dark. But the point is, if the Lions had a track record of having done this in Holmes' first couple drafts and have it worked out, like let's say Amon-Ra St. Brown was actually just like a German guy who had never played football before, and then he became an all-pro slot, it'd be like, wow, I trust them. Isaac Deslot, it's going to work because they did it with that guy. But they haven't paid off any of these yet. And until they do, there isn't really a proof of concept that we know it works. And so when you are taking the swing again, it is going to make people a little freaked out um, because we don't know that it will. And it's putting a lot on the line that it will work.
Yeah. So, I just real quick before we get a little further into Tesla himself, my theory on this trade up is Brad Holmes was going into this draft being like, I don't have a third round pick. He's going into next year being like, I have one third round pick, and then you get the comp picks for Aaron Glenn. I think Brad Holmes is viewing that as found money, and he's like, great. I didn't expect to have these, and now I have them. Guess what? Trade up, because I didn't plan to have them anyways. So, not that it's necessarily the right way. I don't know if there is a right way to view these picks, but I'm willing to wager that Holmes was a little more willing to part with those picks just because he planned to not have them anyways.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I think he also just likes to swing big and
Yeah.
that he doesn't, that and he had a quote on 97.1. He called in radio program in Detroit and he was talking about that he felt like the depth of the recent drafts were not as good as they have been recently, which incentivizes bigger swings, which I thought was an interesting point. Um, oh, just something to file away there.
Yeah.
As for Tesla himself, we talked about this a little bit last week. He's a big guy, 6'3" or 6'4", 4.4 speed, all the other testing stuff. Really good hands. Like, he didn't have a drop, I believe, in college. He can kind of play big slot or X receiver. Like, obviously, it's all there in terms of raw physical tools. Problem is, he didn't even really start last year for Arkansas. He was more like their fourth receiver. I was looking at his like PFF snaps and stuff. He was only playing 20 to 30 snaps a game, and so didn't have a ton of production there. The story is neat from Michigan Lions fan. They buttered it all up after his interview, but he wore the jersey to the redraft interview, and like, if he works, he'll be a cult hero and a fan favorite. Like, that is one thing that is undeniably true about Michiganders, is we love other Michiganders. Like, we love bringing that up. We love guys that are home state heroes. So if it works, he will be an icon, and I hope it does. But at the same time, they kind of need it to, and
Yeah.
that's the risky part in it all.
Well, and as you mentioned, like he was really more of a big slot at Arkansas. There's very little proof of concept of him as an X receiver that you need him to develop into long term. Now, granted, you have time. He is not a starter this year. Tim Patrick is your X receiver. You have the ability to bring Tesla along a little slower, barring injuries, of course. Long term, you hope he turns into like what DJ Chark was, I guess, for the
Yeah.
Lions, that brief stint where he's a little bit, he's got the size and the speed to burn over the top occasionally. He can make the odd contested catch. Is he going to be a superstar? Probably not. But if he can be a very effective two or three at X, depending on what else the Lions got going on at wide receiver and on this offense. Like, I see the potential. It's just a very massive gamble to take with all the assets they used for this pick.
Yeah, but if there's one thing we've sort of learned about Brad Holmes, it's just that he doesn't really care about that.
Yeah.
Right? That, like, he's going to take his guys, and I've said this before with the Broderick Martin thing, is that if you can only pick, and it's easy to say, I would love if Holmes did this without doing that, right? We'd love if he just did the Derek Barnes pick and the Amon-Ra pick and the Lee McNeil pick, and he didn't do the Broderick Martin pick. But at the end of the day, it's the same process.
Yeah.
Right? And if the same process leads to him uncovering all these draft gems and being one of the best draft evaluators, also leads to these occasional follies, if you want to call them that, hypothetically, let's say, which some fans would say, it's separating things that are inextricable. Like, the same thing that leads him to be so good at a lot of picks leads him to these interesting picks, and you just kind of have to accept that. And the balance of it all has benefited the Lions, and until it doesn't, we just kind of have to live with it and hope a few of these pay off.
Yeah, exactly. So, and the Derek Barnes pick is a great example because that was a big trade up to 113 right after Amon-Ra just got picked. And you take a edge rusher that you're going to turn into a Mike linebacker at the NFL based on a couple of drills at the Senior Bowl. That's a big gamble, and that has paid off. Derek Barnes, he earned a contract extension this summer, so no one bats 1,000. Like, you want to bat probably 90% in the first round with getting a starter. Second, on day two, if you can go 50%, get one starter, then that works. Day three, if you can get one out of every four picks to be a starter, for example, or a solid contributor. No one's ever going to bat 1,000. That's not how the NFL draft works. And this is the whole reason that every year we do this routine where it's trust Brad Holmes, because he has a pretty good track record so far. And every year, no one listens.
It's the way I kind of termed it is that, like, in some ways the Tisla pick is making people trust him. Like, it's the ultimate. He's laying down the test. Do you actually trust me? And it turns out some people don't. So,
yeah.
But it did make the draft boring there for a while, because they make that pick and then it's like 100 picks later is their next pick. So there was a lot of downtime.
Almost exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, waiting around with nothing to do.
Well, and speaking of that, 101 picks later, round 5, pick 171, the Lions double dip at the guard position, selecting Miles Frazier out of LSU. Now, to kick this off, I texted you this stat, but I'll say it on the show here. This is from Brett Coleman on YouTube. Frazier had 188 true drop back pass protection reps. Now that does not like true drop back, no screens, no RPOs, like things of that nature, like just true drop backs. I think that was it might have been the most in the country because not a lot of programs run that many true drop back reps in college. So on those 188 reps, 5 total pressures allowed, 0 QB hits. Run blocking could be like needs to be improved to for him to eventually become a starter. But as far as pass protection goes, super good player in that regard, and probably someone that should have gone earlier than round 5.
Yeah, it's funny to follow up this supposedly massive reach with this supposedly massive steal. That, oh, Frazier was supposed to go second, third round. Now all of a sudden you get him way later than he was supposed to. And when I look at him versus Ratledge, I don't see like a major difference between the two prospects. I mean, they were both 3-year starters in the SEC. Both are good in pass pro. Frazier probably a little better there. Ratledge probably a little better on the ground. They both played mostly right tackle, although Frazier has played some left guard, right tackle, right guard, and but Frazier's played a little more left as well as some tackle in his past. So those are little differences, but both those guys are players you project to bring in and think, man, these guys should come in and be able to compete for us in training camp. And I don't think there's a world where Ratledge and Frazier are your two starting guards. I think probably Mahogany and Glasgow, at least one of those guys will win one of the jobs. But Frazier certainly is going to be given that opportunity, and there's reason to think that he could be quite competitive in that positional battle.
Yeah, like well, it's funny because coming into the draft, it was like, so the Lions' starting guards are probably set, but we have no depth. And now you don't even know if the starters are set because you add such lucrative reinforcements here. And the Lions' top 4 guards, like, if there is an injury at guard, you have no reason to be worried this year. Like, all 4 of those guys, you should feel relatively confident in. And, that is obviously a good thing. You talked about the fact that they've both played more right guard. The Lions will cross train them. That's a near certainty. I would imagine there's a very low chance that they walk into the season and they can only play one position. Frazier might get cross trained at center for all I know. Like they still don't have that long term center, so maybe they whether it's Graham is I guess just the backup center, and then you put in one of these other guys at left guard if you need to. Regardless, the guard spot is about as solid as it can be. And for that, I'm grateful.
Yeah, I mean, they should definitely train at least one of Frazier and Ratledge at center. Like, that's something you should explore. You've got all these interior line prospects now. Give it a shot. See what you can do, because that'll always be, potential on the horizon that could be coming up whenever, Ragnow decides he's done.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, the double dipping at guard makes a lot of sense. We talked about it with the Ratledge pick. You're reinvesting in what makes you special. Brad Holmes talked about the emphasis of constantly investing in the offensive line. So if you want it, this is obviously the strength of the Lions team. It's the engine that drives their offense. If you want it to stay that way, you have to keep investing resources into it. So this is like next year they might draft a tackle on day 2 to be the long-term Decker replacement, or a center to be the long-term Ragnar replacement, whatever it may be. I will never complain about offensive line picks though. Like the Manu pick, stretching it a little bit with how much of a project he is, but in terms of just the importance of that position, I'm not going to complain. Now moving on, round 6, pick 196. They finally draft an edge rusher. Ahmed Hassanin, I'm not positive I'm pronouncing that name right. Edge out of Boise State, the first Egyptian player to be drafted into the NFL. There was a funny story that came out that when he was first moving to the States and playing football, he saw a clip of Aaron Donald doing something, and he asked his teammate what high school he went to because he had not heard of the NFL yet.
Yeah, that's it is quite a remarkable story. I will say that I was not um like super familiar listening before the pick was made, but everything I've read since then seems good. Like I like this as a sixth round pick. A guy that is newer to football, has played it now for quite some time because he did play it in high school after he moved from Egypt to the U.S. And then obviously he played it at Boise State. So that's enough years that it's not crazy. But at the same time, he wasn't trained since age 5. So perhaps there's more upside there, which generally when you're drafting in the late rounds, you can either pick between guys that have upside because they were bad in college but have some traits that think they could be good, or they were guys who were really good in college but don't have the athletic sort of traits, right? And the sort of inferred ceiling. And with his background, that gives you more upside than you would think for a guy that was good in college. And that's about as good of a trade off as you can get in the sixth round because this guy was a starter at Boise State. Boise State this past year played in the college football playoff. They played Penn State in the Fiesta Bowl. Like they were a good team. And Hassanin put up 2 double-digit sack seasons with the Broncos. Had pretty good grades with PFF in his production, and obviously seems like a culture fit for the Lions. There was all the talk of his interviews and then his like media call with the reporters after being drafted, and again, kind of like Ratledge, an obvious Campbell sort of guy. So, will they get anything out of Hassanin in terms of actually contributing to the roster at any point? I don't know. Sixth round pick, but I like this as a sixth round pick. It makes sense. I see why they got there, and I hope that he can contribute at some point in his Lions career because it seems like an easy guy to root for.
Yeah, like I think his media call, he said, I will die for you on the football field if you believe in me." Like he's just is super high motor. Like, will he be anything at the NFL? I don't know, but what I do know is he is going to give you whatever his best is. You're going to figure it out. Whether or not that's an NFL player, to be determined. Sixth round pick, but it won't be for a lack of effort on his part. So the Lions fans obviously a little upset they didn't draft an edge earlier, maybe one with more starting potential. Oh well, they addressed the position regardless. So just wasn't the year. I don't know. Like Holmes tried to trade up for one, it didn't work. You got one on day 3, is what it is. Round 7, pick 230, Dan Jackson, a safety out of Georgia. This is pretty simple. He runs fast and he hits hard. This is a special teams pick if I've ever seen one.
Yeah, these last 2 picks from Georgia are both like special teams picks in terms of their path to the roster, which isn't breaking news. That's generally the case for seventh round picks. Dan Jackson, his profile has all of the like the famous like white wide receiver stereotypes. Like even though he's a safety, but like all the famous like oh he's gritty, he's tough, blah blah blah. Like easy to
Real
coach his
cerebral
kid.
player, yeah.
That all shows up in Dan Jackson's scouting report, all the intangibles. Like he was a guy who was at Georgia a long time. He's going to be 25 as a rookie. He was there many years. He didn't start until his final season. He was mostly like a rotational piece on obviously extremely loaded defenses from an NFL talent standpoint. And he played mostly on special teams for a lot of those early years. And then finally, as a super senior, gets the opportunity to start does okay. Not incredible by any stretch. It seemed like tackling was a bit of an issue from what I read. But if he is good at special teams, there's a path to the roster, especially because safety depth is a bit of concern. And we'll talk about that at the moment. This is the only safety they took in the draft. So they really did need a body there. And if he can do special teams well enough, there's a chance he can get to the roster, but not a super athletic guy by any stretch. And again, seventh rounder. So kind of
No,
what you expect.
this will definitely be the kind of guy that'll lay one huge hit in a preseason game that gets everyone amped up, and then it's just whether or not he makes the roster. And then finally, as you mentioned, another Georgia pick, round 7, pick 244, Dominic Lovett, a wide receiver, and look, maybe he could be a long-term Khalif Raymond replacement. I don't know, but this is just, again, it's a 7th-round dart throw. Not much to say.
Yeah. Dominic Lovett, the final pick here, like legit speed, fairly reliable guy, mostly a slot. I thought he was fine when I watched Georgia play. The speed is nice. All you can really say is like obvious gunner, special teams, right? Like,
Yeah.
that's where the speed plays for him. And so between him and Dan Jackson, special teams, special teams, special teams. That's how they'll make the roster. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. See what
One of
happens.
them probably will. Like you,
One of them
of
probably
these
will, yeah.
of these two, you have one gunner between them, and they can figure out who it's going to be. So that's the Lions draft class. What are you, like overall? Like zooming out and looking at this class, what are your overall thoughts?
I think this is a solid draft class overall. Like I would have preferred to see them take a safety a little higher. I would have liked to see them take an edge a little higher, but at the end of the day, they did get some solid players, and they didn't have elite draft capital. I think Williams will be good long term. I think those two interior line picks are really nice, and if Tisla becomes a starting wide receiver, it's a great class. And if he doesn't, then it'll probably feel a little bit on the empty side. But at the end of the day, they only took 3 picks in the top 200. So you're not expecting to get a lot out of that haul. And when you look at this draft as a whole, you have to kind of evaluate it through that lens. Now, part of that lens is the fact they did trade up, but that's their approach to the draft.
Yep.
It is what it is. I think it fortifies quite a bit of the roster, and as a whole, despite some of the consternation, this is still a very good team. And the most obvious hole on the roster was the interior lines OL spot, and they drafted 2 really good prospects to fill that. So I think in even just an immediate sense, they did make the team better, and that's what we were hoping for.
And yeah, like look, we can have gripes on where these positions were taken, but if we look at it in terms of just positions, interior defensive line, guard, wide receiver, edge, safety. Those are all the needs we identified, and those are the only positions they took in this draft. It's not like they went off the board for a running back or for a tight end or anything. They only took positions of need. And look, Williams will be a starter possibly this year, if not then next year. Ratledge or Frazier, one of them will eventually be a starter. I'm confident in that. Tesla, you hope. Like as you said, that'll probably be the key determine like whether or not this is a good class or an okay class is if he develops. Pretty content with like it's hard to be mad at the positions they took overall. So with that being said, oh yeah, go ahead.
They got bodies at the position they needed bodies for, and some people would prefer higher picks for some of those spots, but at the end of the day, they did get players where they needed players. So
yeah, exactly. So now we're going to go to our NFC North corner. We're just going to quickly run through each team's draft. We'll start here with the Green Bay Packers. Round 1, pick 23, Matthew Golden. Round 2, pick 54, Anthony Belton, an offensive tackle. Round 3, pick 87, Savion Williams, a receiver. Round 4, pick 124, Baron Sorrell, defensive end. In round 5, they get another defensive end, Colin Oliver. Round 6, they get another defensive lineman, Warren Brinson. They get a corner in round 7, Micah Robinson, and another offensive lineman at the back of the draft, 250, John Williams. Now, the flagship, like the big pick from the Packers is just the fact that they actually took a wide receiver in the first round, but they're in the top 100. They double up on receiver and they get an offensive tackle. They're just investing in making Jordan Love's life easier. Well, I like Williams. Whatever. They have so many bodies at wide receiver that I don't really see what the point is of that pick. But Matthew Golden, what does he project to be, and how, I guess, not worried, but like, how frustrating is it that he went to the Packers?
I'm not that concerned by that selection. We talked about Golden a little bit last week in our draft preview. Solid player. Like, I think he'll be a useful NFL receiver. I still don't really feel any differently than I did before the draft in terms of Green Bay has a lot of number 2 and number 3 receivers and no number 1 receiver. It still kind of feels that way. Like maybe Golden will outperform his projections, but I never was blown away by him. Like I don't think he is. I don't see him in a Marvin Harrison Jr. mold. Like he's just a solid college player. Can do a lot of different things. Can run any different route. Like I think he'll be useful. The biggest talk there is that yeah, they took the first round receiver first time in was like 20 years, something like that. It's a long time since they last took a first round receiver. All those years with Aaron Rodgers, they never did. It was such a talking point. Now finally they do it, and they did it for a prospect that never really jumped off the page to me, even though I do think he's good. Belton, the Lions met with him. I think he's more of an interior lineman than a tackle, but he played tackle at NC State. I don't know, seems fine. Savion Williams, again, they have 15 receivers. They already had a lot of receivers. Now they have even more. We'll see how it shakes out, I guess. I didn't feel like I came away from that draft being like, wow, the Packers crushed it. Like I think they got some okay players, and we'll see if that actually changes the needle or moves the needle or not.
Yep. And then the Vikings, weird draft for them because they had one top 100 pick, and that was in the first round. They take Donovan Jackson, 24th overall. In the third round, they get Ty Felton, the wide receiver. Fifth round, Tyrion Ingram Dawkins, that's a defensive end. Sixth round, Kobe King, linebacker, and another sixth round pick. The very next pick, actually, they had 201 and 202. They get tight end Gavin Bartholomew. Bit of a weird one, but the most impact player, obviously, Donovan Jackson, shoring up the interior of the offensive line. What are your just rapid fire thoughts on him?
Um, I thought Donovan Jackson was a solid player at Ohio State. I'll be very curious to see where Minnesota uses him. We talked about this a little bit last week when I touched on him. He was mostly a guard at Ohio State, then he moved to tackle, seemed really bad at it at first, and then got a lot better. By the time the draft rolled around, there were people who thought he's a tackle. Some still think he's a guard. That's my most curious point of this. Otherwise, should be solid. Ty Felton, that receiver they took out of Maryland, like he was a pretty good player for them. Probably not like a major needle mover, but
when you have Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, I don't think any receiver is going to be a needle mover.
Yeah, and was this because of the Dallas Turner and the trade up last year? Like, why did they have so few picks? I didn't look up why.
I think it might be from last year. I can look it up. Because yeah, it's very uncharacteristic for the Vikings are usually the team that they trade down and they'll have 45 picks in the draft.
Yeah,
I don't know.
and the subplot with the Vikings that it's worth talking about with the draft is just the fact that since they made their GM change back in early 2022, they've been pretty bad at the draft. Like they've done really well in their pro scouting. They've gotten a lot of good free agents to help supplement their team, but their draft classes have been pretty underwhelming. So I'm curious to see if they can hit a little bit higher average with this one, but with only 5 picks and only one of them high, in all likelihood, you're really just hoping that Donovan Jackson works out and gives J.J. McCarthy, good protection.
So they did trade their 2020, like this year's third round pick last year to trade up for Turner. They also traded their fourth round pick. I don't know what happened to their second round pick because I'm not seeing it. I have no idea what happened to their second round pick, but yeah, very weird. The Vikings are just a weird team, man. They're just one of those weird teams that every year you're like, wow, they got so much worse in the offseason and they're still like usually fine. So I don't know. Not much else to say about that. Then lastly, the Chicago Bears, who we talked about, Ben Johnson. Hey, he might be trying too hard to be the Detroit Lions. And 10th overall. Everyone was talking about, oh, they're going to trade up for Ashton Genty. Raiders take him at 6. Bears don't get that chance. So then it was like, oh, the Bears are going to take Tyler Warren. He's the highest rated tight end in this class. They actually go for the other first round tight end in this class, Colston Loveland, which that was probably the first like surprise pick of the first round. Maybe like the fact that the Jags traded up for Travis Hunter maybe is in there, but that was the first like real surprise pick. In the second round, they get Luther Burden, wide receiver, who started to slip a little bit, could have been a first rounder. They also They had 3 second-round picks. They get Ozzy Trapilo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Shamar Turner, defensive end. Trapilo, offensive lineman. In the 4th round, Ruben Hypolite, a linebacker. 5th round, cornerback Za Frazier. In the 6th round, guard Luke Newman. And wrapping up the draft in the 7th round, they get running back Kyle Monangai. I
Nunga,
don't.
yeah.
Yeah, I have some weird names in this draft.
Yeah, so the Bears, starting with Loveland, I kind of heard going back to a couple weeks before the draft that Loveland was one of those guys that was going to go higher than people thought, that like the NFL teams were higher on him than the mock draft people were. I think he'll be a good player for the Bears. They've invested a lot of draft capital in receivers recently. Between Rome Odunze last year, that was a very high selection. Was that like 8th or 9th in that draft?
Yep.
Now you go 10 with Loveland. So those guys, they need to become stars, and that offense needs to sort of take off this year. And then you take Luther Burden in the 2nd round, which I love that pick for them. I like Luther Burden a lot. They are putting it all on the table. There are no excuses for Caleb Williams now. Needs to make this happen with those picks. The tackle from Boston College, I don't know that guy. I don't watch Boston College. Jamar Turner, defensive tackle from A&M. I was kind of okay on him. Then the rest of this draft is like deep cuts from the Big Ten sort of guys. Ruben Hypolite II, I was dying laughing when I saw that pick. Maryland has had this revolving door for the last few years of these linebackers who have just the craziest names ever. So you had Ruben Hypolite II. There was Jeremy Spraggins. Jeremy spelled Gereme.
Oh.
I think there was Ahmad McCullough was one of them. Just the strangest names you'd ever heard. And they were all awful. Just horrible. And Ruben Hypolite was very much one of those. But because it's Maryland, they recruit good athletes. They just don't know how to teach them football. So I saw Hypolite's testing numbers. I was like, yeah, that's why he got drafted. But good luck to teaching him. Hopefully he can receive some proper instruction that he never got at Maryland. Luke Newman, I was also surprised about that one. I don't recall him being on draft radars when I looked at Michigan State. But again, I guess he had a really good testing profile. And then Monangai, he was a dude in the Big Ten. I always liked Kyle Monangai. He was at Rutgers for like 5 years and was always good. Maybe he's the next Isaiah Pacheco. We'll see what happens. Some funny names late in that draft. But the biggest takeaway for Chicago is they're giving Caleb Williams all the weapons he could possibly need, and now it's on him to make it happen.
Oh no, don't worry. If they don't have a run game, it's all DeAndre Swift's fault still. Don't worry. So that wraps up NFC North corner. Again, honestly, like the draft for all 4 NFC North teams is okay. Yeah, like those are solid, mostly solid picks. You get a few weird ones in there maybe, but I don't think that anything the Lions did in this draft is going to change the Lions are still going to be expected to win the division. I don't think the Packers, anything they did is going to push them over the top necessarily. Same with the Vikings. The Bears, you're hoping to be more competitive for a playoff spot, and like you said, it's all on Caleb Williams now, so they'll sink or swim with him. So now, just to wrap up the show, finally, the Lions, they're top 5 in consensus power rankings still. How do we feel about the roster as a whole, the full 90-man roster, as we head into the real offseason?
Overall, I feel that this is a pretty good roster still. Not a lot to complain about. Should you look at the offensive side of the ball, should still be top 3 to 5 in the NFL. It's always hard to kind of price in how all the offenses will shake up, but all the weapons are back, all the pieces are back. The only thing that isn't is Kevin Zeitler, and they invested significantly in the draft to plug that spot. They now have really good interior OL depth. They brought Skipper back to give them some tackle depth. Hopefully this year you start to see some returns from Giovanni Manu. You have all your dudes at wide receiver, tackle, running back. You added some receiver depth into Slaw and Lovett. Like this offense should carry the day even without Ben Johnson. I have Very high expectations for that group. And then you flip over to defense, and the other edge spot still does stand out as really the one spot on the defense that feels like it's got a less than satisfactory starter. Just sitting in the moment, if you have it's 11 starter defense. And so if you have 10 starters that are good and at least like 5 or 6 of them are Pro Bowl all pro caliber, you can survive with one spot that isn't up to par. Now, I would like to see them find a way to bring back Zadarius Smith. I don't know if that will happen. They are still in this weird, like, talking point. Seems like they've told Zadarius what the price is, and he can decide if he wants to settle for that. They interestingly signed his nephew, Jackson Meeks, from Syracuse as a UDFA, and they gave him 200,000 guaranteed. So they seem to think this guy is a solid prospect. If you bring back Zadarius Smith, I feel really good about the situation. If you don't, then you're basically just going to be looking for Zadarius Smith. Right? Like, we talked about that at the start of last year. Those first 3-4 weeks of the season, we kept saying, oh, they're going to need to trade for some help on the opposite side of Hutchinson. Then after Hutchinson went down, it became they're looking for all of the help. If getting Hutchinson back will help the pass rush a lot, I think some of the discourse around edge was based around that, that people watched most of a season play out without a top 5 pass rusher in the NFL, and so it's like, wow, our pass rush is terrible. We got to fix this big time. And it's like, well, getting him back will do a lot of the fixing. But they will still need to reinforce that spot at some point, however they choose to do that. But otherwise, you have stars at tackle, stars at edge, really good linebackers, and great linebacker depth. Even in signing a guy like Grant Stewart in the offseason, who played some starting linebacker for the Colts last year. Then you move into the secondary. You have 2 Pro Bowl safeties. You have a lot of depth now at corner. Like, this roster looks really good. The only things that I'm really watching for is that starting edge. And honestly, I would feel a lot better if they signed a depth safety at some point before training camp, because right now you're one injury away from going from a Pro Bowler to either a 7th round rookie or a guy named Morris Norris, who we didn't really know about, and then he appeared randomly in a playoff game. But like that spot just is a little uncomfortable at the moment. So I would like to see them shore that up a little bit. But again, if you're in a position where you're talking about the 11th best defensive starter on your team and your depth safeties as the concerns, you're in a really good spot. And as you mentioned, I think they should enter the year as a clear favorite in the division. They have a really hard schedule, but also so do the other teams in their division, because the other teams in their division also have to play the Eagles and Commanders and Ravens. Like that, it's a tough schedule, but everyone's got a tough schedule in this division, and I think they should be favored to be on top of it.
Yeah, and I don't expect the Lions, like, no one is saying the Lions are going to win 15 games again. That was an anomaly, especially considering the injuries. But conceivably, it, like, barring Johnny Morton just being a terrible offensive coordinator, you should have a top 5 run game and a top 5 pass game. Defensively, with Tyleik Williams and hopefully a healthy everyone else except for Ellie McNeil to start the year, you should be able to get back to top 5 run defense. And then you're in a position where you just need the pass defense to be average. If you are top 5 in 3 out of 4 categories and you are average in pass defense, you will be okay and you will win a bunch of games. I fully expect this to be an 11, 12, 13 win team next year. Will they go 6-0 in the division? Probably not, but you should still go 4-2, 5-1. So the Lions, the Lions have bigger aspirations. The goal is the Super Bowl. Obviously, they hope the injury luck is a little bit more on their side next year, but that's months away, so we don't have to worry about that right now. It's a very good roster, and now we just have, this is the painful part, is now we have to wait for the season and for training camp and all that. But the Lions do have, weirdly enough, the Lions and Chargers are playing the Hall of Fame game, so we get an extra preseason game this year. So that'll be nice. I think that's at the end of July or start of August. I don't know if they changed the date to be, was it July 31st, was it?
Yeah, ridiculous. There should not be preseason football being played in July. That's
Yeah.
that is
So,
terrible.
But anyways, with that being said, that is going to be a wrap for us, essentially for the season. And then just to close out, Alex, do you have any final thoughts before we wrap for the off season?
No, not really. I I think that they did a fine job in the off season restocking the roster, and it should be another fun year ahead. And hopefully, not everyone will get injured this time.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for tuning in. If you made it this far, make sure to hit like and subscribe on the YouTube page, follow us on podcasting platforms, and leave a review. You can find the show on Twitter at Payne and Drain. You can find me at ZachPayne41, Alex at Alex_Drain. And we will see you guys when we see you guys, I guess. I don't know. So everyone, enjoy the off season. Enjoy the rest of your day, week, whenever you're consuming this podcast. And yeah, thanks for a great season. Cheers.